The river kept its secrets in a roar that never slept. It split the highland valley like a wound, wide and cold and white with foam, carrying mountains down into the sea grain by grain. The sky above it was sword bright, metallic with thin clouds. Wind combed the grass, set the thorn trees whispering. Far upstream, thunder spoke from behind ridges where no one had names for the stones. On the valley's shelf, along a trail scored by hooves and boots, two peoples moved as one for the first time in living memory. The Vuri ran in a file, low and powerful, tails balanced, fur salted with dust, their long ears canted toward the river's voice. They were a pack species born of cliffs and cold meadows, jointed for leaping, lungs built for thin air. Each adult wore corded bracelets of fiber and metal shards that clinked as they moved. Each adolescent carried a sling. The cubs, awkward, still soft about the paws and bright-eyed, kept to the center where elders circled them in, noses lifted to scent for danger. Among them, alien as a lone pine in grassland, walked a human named Mara Quinn. She wore an old jacket chalked with dried river mud and patched at the elbows, a pack whose seams were cleanly hand-stitched, a knife on a lanyard, and a coil of braided line over her shoulder. She had no fur to bristle, no tail to balance, no claws to find purchase on slick rock. She had only the odd human gifts, stubbornness that grew stronger when told to wait, a stride that didn't break even when the trail did, and a quiet conviction that good was real if you did it. She had been on care 3 seasons. She had come with a survey team and stayed with nothing but a radio and a promise. The radio had fallen silent after the storms that tore the orbital relay into fire. The promise remained. There were ruins inland, half swallowed by the hills, etched stones of a civilization older than the rushgrass, older than Vuri's song. Mara had found breath-carved chambers under quartz arches, and a broken causeway to the river with carved marks that matched human mathematics like distant cousins. She had walked into the highlands to keep them safe from the mining rigs that would come if communication ever returned. The Vuri called her River Sister quietly when they thought she couldn't hear. The first name they gave had not been kind. Now the pack moved toward the river ford at Hal Thrash. The season had turned its teeth toward flood. The glacier heads in the east had exhaled, sending melt and rain together, and the shallows the pack used each year were muscled by brown, fast water. But the crossings could not wait. Winter would come with iron under its paw, and the herds needed lower ground where the wind could pass over them like a hand without taking heat away. The pack had maps in their feet. Vuri memory is long and precise. They knew when to go and when to wait. This time there was no wait left. They came to the lip of the gorge with its granite shoulders and the narrowest spines of rock where one could step if one did not think about the drop and the current taking everything. The elders fanned out. Big males with the scarring of old avalanches along their flanks stood, and their ears made short angles. Alphas in bands of beaten copper moved to the edge and studied the foam. A cub reached out with a paw toward spray and was cuffed on the shoulder by a mother who said nothing. Mara set down her pack. Her boots felt every stone. The river's smell was iron and root, deep water that remembered glaciers. She blinked against sun glare and felt her throat tighten. A little earth had rivers like this. She had run beside the Kenai once, a week on foot because she wanted to learn what a river would teach if she gave it time. The memory came with the taste of salmon cooked on alder and a friend's laugh. That was a lifetime ago. Her friends were old on a world that had not heard from her. One of the alphas, Tavan of the Gorge, stood over her. He was not tall for a Vuri. He had a pivot scar at his left knee, an old battle before the truce. He had been the one to tell her she could walk at the edge of the pack as long as she did not look any cub in the eyes, an old formality kept for older reasons. Now he said, quiet, "Water is high." Mara nodded. "High," she agreed. "We cross in pairs, old with old, strong with strong, cubs last." "Not last," she said, and turned to show the coil of rope over her shoulder. Taven looked at the line. He had seen humans use rope as if it were a promise you could throw. He had seen Mara pull a hunter out of a ravine with a harness made of her own belt and the woven leash of a furry scouting beast. He studied her hands, the scar at the base of the thumb from a thorn hawk's beak, the callus where her paddle had ruined it on her first season. Vuri did not say please. They judged, decided did. His ears tipped. "What do you need?" he asked. "Anchor points. There. She pointed to 3 boulders dark with spray and slick moss. "I'll set a line across. Tether the old, the weak, and the ones who forget fear. Cubs near the center where the water pushes but doesn't grind." Taven's mouth parted to show the edge of teeth. It was not a smile and not an argument. "You go first then," he said, because any plan's price was this. She nodded. "I go first." The pack spread along the rim. The young watched in a silence that vibrated with questions they'd been taught not to ask. Elders moved with the slow economy of meaningful work. No wasted motion, no sound that did not keep courage intact. The alphas made a space where the crossing would begin. Mara looped the rope around the first boulder, wedged it into the stone's crack, and set a friction hitch that would hold until the rock itself forgot it was stone. She took a breath and let it out slow. Below her, the river went on kicking itself into white. The narrow ledge where she would step had trapped driftwood, thorns of branch that hung suspended, rattling and then quiet again. She tied a loop around her waist, then another under her armpits, a makeshift harness that would constrict if the current took her. The last hitch wrapped twice around her belt, quick and brutal. She looked up. Taven's eyes were on her. Behind him, a cub stood on his hind legs for a better view, a little dark thing with a stripe of lighter color across the nose, ears too big for his head. His mother drew him back. He wriggled, curious. Mara had seen him tumble so many times and get up again laughing, a very emotion that sounded like a yip, as if surprise and joy were cousins. The cub's name was Aru. He had touched Mara's wrist once like a secret. "You'll be fine," Mara said, not moving her mouth much because the pack watched lips. "You'll be fine as a nail." She stepped onto the ledge. The chill ran up through her legs like a living thing. Water clawed at her calves. She set her feet sideways, shoulders angled upstream, body loose but with tension in it like a bow at half draw. The rope went taut slowly. She shuffled, testing each step, feeling the smear of algae, the grit under it, the slight give of dead moss. Spray soaked her jacket. The river spoke louder here, not a voice, a sustained note that got into her ribs. She moved around the first bend and was out of the pack's sight. The ledge narrowed to a knife point, chipped by flood, slick as bone. She jammed her right boot into a crack, pivoted, and felt her left foot slip. The rope tightened. Her heart made a single strike like a hammer. Easy, she told herself. She did not pray. There was nothing listening here except rock and water, and both knew honest work. She reached the far boulder. Its surface was pocked and polished at once. She braced a knee against it and hugged it like something warm, then got the pack's coil off her shoulder and looped more line across the current to the next. She worked with fingers numb at the tips and teeth that wanted to chatter. She kept them still. The anchors held. The line tightened and sang. Her hands came back pink and dead when she reached the pack again. The Vuri moved in. She bound loops around gray fur ankles and strong shoulders, crossed the lines over broad chests and underbellies, nodded with a rhythm that was not hers at first and then suddenly was. One by one the elders moved into the water, braced on paws, the line across their backs like a mountain's hand. The old male with the avalanche scar went first, then a mother who had lost a litter 2 winters ago. She moved steady like she owed the river nothing. The pack made their way across in a low procession, time becoming a shape they held between them. A young one slipped and the line held. He found his footing and did not look back, because looking back was a promise the current would always collect. Mara stayed at the anchor. She listened. She watched the rope for sudden sings she didn't like, for harmonics that meant something was wrong. In the gorge's throat, sound ran in circles. It was difficult to pick movements from noise. She stared until her eyes watered, wiped them with the heel of her hand, and stared again. Then shouting, sudden and thin. Not very words exactly, but the urgent barked syllables that meant danger and loss in any language. On the pack's far side, a cluster of adults pivoted and surged, tails high, fur spiking, heads low. Something small and dark spun in the current like a leaf. One cub had gone, slipped out from under an arm, maybe clambered up a rock to see better, maybe dared the edge because young come to cliffs the way sparks come to dry grass. He had fallen and the river had taken him. The line across the gorge was too high for him to seize. He vanished under white, surfaced 30 meters downstream and rolled with his mouth open, trying to bite air. The alphas on the far side surged forward and then halted, paralyzed by time's sudden knife. If they leaped where the cub tumbled, they would lose footing. If they ran downstream, there were only slick rocks that would break bones before the current could. There were rules, older than language, for a pack at a river's edge. The first rule said, "We do not give the river more than it has already stolen." Mara left her anchor without really thinking. Her body moved before ideas caught up. Her hands were at the rope on her waist, and then the knot was loose and she was running uphill along the gorge through thorn and under limb, boots finding what they needed fast. She cut down toward the river where the gorge widened a little, and the water made a slick tongue over granite. She had seen something like it once and had not forgotten. Her pack thunked against her back and she let it go. It hit stone and bounced, and she didn't watch it. She hit the water like a thrown hammer. The cold bit all the way through. The river tried to roll her over and she made herself long, made her arms wide, kicked with her toes, towing stone until there was no stone and only water. She let the current take her, but not completely. She angled her shoulders like a fish does, the way you learn if you've mapped enough water's grammar with your skin. She breathed when there was air, she didn't when there wasn't. She swam toward the little flailing shape that went under and came up with eyes rimmed white. His fur was slick as a seal's. He was bigger than a human infant, smaller than a wolf. He saw her and made a desperate, shocked sound that was nothing like language and exactly like plea. She reached, caught tufts of fur at his scruff and the leather harness that furry cubs wore with trinkets tied to it for luck, for scent, for belonging. It slipped. She took him again with a hook under the foreleg and wrenched him up against her body. He bit her jacket in panic. Her arm went around his chest with a grip that would have bruised if he had been softer. She felt his heartbeat, flittering too fast. The river spun them like a dance. She angled to a diagonal line she had learned as a child on Earth in a creek that had no name anybody else knew. She let the current carry them toward a slice of boulders hard against the far bank where water piled, and she could maybe jam a hip and speak rock until rock answered. They hit the boil and were thrown. Her shoulder struck stone, and something bright detonated in her vision. Her shoulder went numb. She lost breath and got it back because not getting it back would be the end. The cub wriggled and she clamped down. Her knees scraped. Her boots found something and stuck and skidded and stuck again. She let the water run across her and above her, not her enemy but a force to measure and work. She was a lever jammed between current and stone. She wedged them into a narrow gap where moss clung like old writing. With her free hand she fumbled for the knife. Her fingers were stupid with cold. The blade slid up, bit into the cub's harness where it had snagged and was strangling him with the river's hand. She cut. The cub coughed. She used her head against him, tucking him into her neck like a child asleep in a train's noise and hurry. "You're okay," she said, breathless. "You're okay, you're okay." On the bank there was no sound now, silence like a room where a body lay. The alphas stood with their heads lowered, which was not submission exactly, more the posture taken when the world reveals that it is bigger than rules. Tavan of the Gorge's ears were flat. His paws were rooted like trees. Mara lifted the cub high against the stone and set him up onto rock. He scrabbled with nails and found purchase and flopped like a seal. He lay panting, eyes made of night. He looked at her with blank animal shock and then slowly recognition. He made a sound. It was a tiny, raw thing. A mother barreled in from the side and swept him up, gathering him with both forelegs and her head and her teeth gentle as rain, crooning a sound older than anything the Vuri made in battle. Mara pulled herself up with the leftover electricity of fear running light down her limbs. Her body did not want to believe it was done. It wanted another thing to pull, another thing to hold. She found none. The stone was there and so was sky. Her shoulder began to throb. Blood dripped from a scrape on her jaw. The water poured past as if nothing had moved it and nothing ever would. A hush gathered like mist. The alphas stood in a ring. There were gestures for contempt, for patience, for dismissal. There were gestures for respect. Many required spareness, most required courage. None were used much. Now Tavan of the Gorge stepped forward and bowed his head low, and put his muzzle to the stone near her boot. No touch, only breath. After him, another alpha did, and another, until the ring was a circle of lowered heads, the copper bands chiming softly when their forelegs braced. Mara did not know if this was for her or for the river, for what it had not taken. She stood very still. Her heart was too loud for another minute. She swallowed and her throat clicked. Tavan lifted his head and his eyes were different. The change was small as a breath and as complete as a change of tide. "River sister," he said in a tone that had no edge left in it. "You moved before thought." She let a corner of her mouth quirk. "That's usually the dangerous way," she said. "It is the way that Mentaru breathes." The cub, cradled by his mother, made a series of too bright sneezes, little explosions that meant water in the nose. Terror turned to something else. The pack kept their heads low, as much to let the mother and cub be unseen as to honor the moment. If the river ever had memory, it was alive in them now. They crossed again, all of them, in the new quiet that followed a thunderclap. The rest of the day moved like a taut rope, slow enough not to snap. The crossing took more hours than the pack had expected to spend there. The sun rinsed thin light over the far ridge and the wind picked up as afternoon turned toward evening. When the last of them made the far bank, when the anchors were unwound and the knots untied, the pack gathered in a half-oval where the slope relaxed. They built no fire. Vuri did not burn wood in this season this close to the river. Mara sat with her back against a stone that held the day's heat like a hand. When the alphas came, they sat without ceremony. Tavan drew a line in the dust with his claw and studied it as if it were a map. Another leader, Hosey of the Long Reach, who wore 2 copper bands for victories in a spring that had turned badly, cleared his throat. "We have a new rule," he said. "When cubs fall, humans fly." Mara huffed a breath that might have been a laugh if there had been more muscle left in it. "We don't fly," she said without looking up. "We fall better." "We will learn from that," Hosey said, and it was not flattery. Night arrived like a curtain. The stars came hard and cold, too many to count if you cared for count. Somewhere upstream something fell into the river with a sound like a boot dropped in water and was gone. Mara drifted under and then surfaced again into a doze. She woke to paws near her face and the smell of warm fur. Aru had wriggled away from his mother and lay with his ribs against Mara's thigh. He seemed surprised by his own boldness and very pleased. He watched her with one eye and then slept because the day had taken everything. Mara let him be. She rested the back of a hand lightly on his side where breath moved. That pace calmed hers. The day after, the pack followed the river down the valley toward lower meadows. The Vuri moved with their usual tireless economy. The elders did not mention what had happened. The young practiced the hush. Mara found the ache deeper in her shoulder. She favored it without making a show of favoring anything. The river, glutted and tireless, ran alongside them, a kind of companion you did not expect to help or forgive. They came to the second ford, wider, slower, trickier. The pack had always crossed where the river relaxed into a braided flow among shingle bars. This time the bars were gone, scoured away. The flood had rewired the channel. Mara and Tavin stood and counted eddies. The water was high and cloudy, carrying sticks and leaves and sometimes larger surprises. The door of a remote Vuri hut, torn from its hinges, a cooking pot with a dent like a mountain in miniature. Downstream, a tree lay caught in a bend, its roots a brown crown. The branches flexed and threatened. The pack wanted to go. You could feel the impatience like a shared muscle twitching through them. But Tavin's head moved a degree and his tail made a warning almost invisible, and the whole mass settled again. Only the cubs fidgeted, and even they tried to pretend they did not. Mara cut poles from a stand of willow with her knife, her good hand doing what both would have done if it could. She tested depth with one, found the long shallow where the current ran fast but where the bottom stayed even. She moved like someone writing in a language the river could read. Tavin watched and copied, marking with his paw where it would be safest to step. The elders drilled the adolescents in the new habit of tying themselves to one another with the line Mara had given them cross-knotted in a harness that did not cut ribs. Vuri bodies leaned into the fact of it and grew more bearable to themselves, as if a physics had been expanded to include community. By evening they had crossed, all of them, with only minor slips and one dropped pack that was recovered with a half-finished curse and much laughter. They camped where the valley widened and the river was a long flat line reflecting sky, and the wind shaped long waves through grass. Here, old stones lifted from the plain like the teeth of something that had bitten once and frozen. The stones had marks on them that matched the marks at the causeway Mara had seen in the hills. Some were geometric and exact, others rough as photographs of dreams. The Vuri had made their own marks across them in past centuries. Scratches, chewed notches, the names of ancestors who had died here. 2 languages, 3 overlapped like songs. Mara walked among the stones with her pack's weight of comfort. Her feet made scuffs that sounded foolish in such a place. She touched one of the marks lightly with the tips of her fingers. "You read that?" Tavin asked behind her. "Not read," she said. "I know the tune, the shapes make numbers, ratios, distances, see here. This is a triangle and this number is not a number but a promise. It shows what doesn't change when everything else does." She looked at him. The people who made it measured rivers. Why write that on stone? Tavin's head tilted, his ears pivoted toward an upstream sound and then back to her. "To remember," she said, "to prove to their great-great that they saw what they saw, to leave a kind of hand in the world to touch later. That's all math is, a way of touching when your body can't go there." "You're a strange animal," he said without heat. "You throw yourself into danger for a small one you do not know. You spend your words on rocks." Mara shrugged. "It puts the same heat in my chest," she said. He considered that. "We have an old story," he said. "It says the river is not ours, we are its. That when we cross, we are not moving through the water but through the river's attention. It might choose to remember us or not. Yesterday it remembered you." "It remembered Aru," she said. "That is the same." As the sun lowered, a line of cloud climbed the sky like a wall being raised. The wind changed. The river's sound tightened. The Vuri built their shelters in the lee of the stones. They laid down woven mats. They made a nest of themselves for the young and the elders in the center out of bodies and covered them with oiled fiber sheets. The sky muttered. The first drops came heavy and far apart like someone dropping pebbles to get your attention. Then the rain set in, sheeted, hard, relentless. The valley turned to 1,000 small rivers. The big river became a single muscle. Mara slept in a shallow, with the oiled sheet over her face and water coursing past her boots. She did not mind. She had slept in worse. A voice got her up before dawn, a pack sound like a low bell, the call used when stealth is necessary but also speed. She came out into a world diluted into grays. The river had climbed its banks in the night. It had bitten the field away in a single mouthful here, and over there it had carved a new channel around a stone. Shelter mats had floated. Vuri were moving fast and careful, collecting items and bodies before the water could claim them. A pup barely weaned had wandered. Someone scooped it and put it in a basket where it blinked and then accepted fate and slept. Taven was at the edge, looking at something that had no name this close and had many names far away. The Stilling, a dam, not made by Vuri hands. Far above the river's curve, in the place where the hills made a tight-boned fist, a mass of trees and stone and ice had jammed into a temporary wall. It held back an inland sea that could not wait long. It had been done by storm and geology, but the Vuri would not care about that when the result came through. When it broke, it would be a single note the valley would never stop hearing. "We have to move," Hosey said, calm but with scars bright. "We need high ground, the eastern shelf." "It's too far," a matriarch said. "The little ones, the old ones will. We have hours," Taven said, and his voice was not sure. Mara watched. She measured, not the distance to the shelf, the language of water. The dam would not hold long. It would fail like a tendon giving up under weight. The Vala's neck would capture the first rush, and then the body of it would come. If they climbed to the east shelf, they would be safe, yes, but they would lose more than their breath in the run. They would lose half their food and most of the bones that carried memory. It would leave the pack a husk. She looked at the stones with the marks. The Vuri had used them as windbreaks, as scratch pads for grief. The old makers had used them as anchors for numbers. Many were driven deep. They went down into soil like knees. Between them, rope could sit and not slip. The pack had rope now because she did. Her eyes lifted to the line of thorn trees further up the slope. Their roots knitted the hillside. If you ran a line to them and to the stones and then over the river to the boulder field on the other side, you could build a web that, when the flood came, would give the water something to spend itself on. Not stop it. Nothing could. But you could gift it a kind of work where it would lose anger as friction and vibration instead of as the ripping of bodies. She turned to Taven. "I need every cord," she said. "Every sling, every tether, every withered old length of plaited hair you use for memory. Take them and tie them end to end. Weave them into 3 long ropes thicker than a wrist. Take the mats too, roll them, lash them so they won't drift. Use the poles we cut, we'll make a curtain." Taven's ears moved in small circles as if catching a sound he preferred not to mishear. "We will still need to run." "We will still need to run," she agreed, "but slower, while others work." He nodded. His voice grew loud and precise with command. Vuri moved the way every muscle in a body moves when the brain commits fully. They gathered cordage, their leashes, their forgotten ties, their ritual braids from old lives kept in bundles for weddings and funerals. They took their slings apart and braided them into a greater strength. They pulled the woven edges from mats and burned hands hauling across grass. Mara set the pattern. She took the first rope and looped it around the rooted stones and took it upslope to a tree and pulled until her shoulders sang like wire. She anchored the rope to another stone, then another. She laced the second rope lower, with mats hung as flappers that would knock the water's silver teeth out. She tied the third across the river itself, using the line the pack had already learned as they crossed. The far bank was slick and mean, and she scraped her shin and laughed once because pain still had a place in a world that allowed laughter. Vuri on the far side wedged themselves as living anchors. They lowered their heads. The sky darkened as if it had decided matters. The Stilling lifted a little around its edges. A sigh, a warning, a rehearsal. Birds went someplace else. The air tasted like struck iron. Mara walked along the newly made curtain and checked knots with fingers that felt like a collection of rocks put in a glove. She frowned when one was sloppy and retied it, and the adolescent who had made it watched and then copied like his blood would remember later. She finished, turned, and looked up the valley. She thought of numbers. She thought of the way water carries the memory of where it has been. She thought of the way humans carry the memory of fights won and lost, and keep finding new fights to lay down on top of that. "Ready," she said. The flood announced itself with a single low crack. Then a sound like 10,000 drums exploded all at once from a place that was so far away the delay made a theater of the moment. It hit the valley with all the dull body of a falling wall. The first wave came low and heavy, water thrown by momentum stacked and then spilled itself in layers. The curtain took it. The mats slammed against cords and flattened like giant gills. The poles bowed. Vuri on the far bank dug in and braced. The rope's song went high, close to screaming, and then tore into a lower note as knots tightened to a new hard. Water spilled around. It still came. The second wave carried trunks like battering rams. The curtain shivered and hummed. Half the mats tore. The second rope held. The third went slack for a breath when a trunk caught it, then snapped and sent the trunk sideways into stones where it shattered in a spray of brown and bright sap. The first wall of water spent itself across friction points, and the life in it went a little out. The pack moved, half of them along the eastward tilt, shepherding the old and the very young in pairs roped together as if they were a single thought. The others stood at the curtain and replaced ties on the fly, plugging holes with woven blankets and their own bodies, making themselves part of the web. Mara felt the rope through her hands as a live thing, an animal she had to soothe. Her palms burned. Her shoulders screamed now without art. She pulled and tied and leaned and breathed in river and mud and fear and courage as one scent. Beside her, Tavin's arm moved in time with hers and his muzzle was a line. He said nothing. He did not need to. The third wave was the body of the flood. When it came, all the valley's shapes changed. Trees that had been landmarks all season were gone in an instant, taken downstream like new ideas. Stones that had held 100 winters rolled like dice and came up with different faces. The curtain bowed and then tore across 3 spans. A pole broke. A Vuri was knocked off his feet and caught by the line at his waist, while 2 others took a step without thinking and held him until his paws found the earth again. The web sagged. For a breath, the world balanced and could have gone either way. Mara reached for the knot at the center span because she had to be there, because there was no one else close enough, because her hands were already there. She made 1 loop into 2. She moved the bite of the line to a new angle where the rock's shape would not cut it. She leaned her weight into it and felt the whole thing lift enough to take a breath. Her vision narrowed to the next foot of rope. The next foot. The next. Then, like all things carried to a peak, the flood went briefly calm. Not calm as in silent. Calm as in something had been decided and now there was only arithmetic to deal out. The water level began to drop half a finger, then a finger. The curtain did not come to rest. It would never be what it had been, but it stopped looking like a wound and became a bandage. The trunks were gone, the stones settled. In the slack that the river grudgingly offered, the pack moved the rest of them up the slope to the black line the flood would not cross. Aru stood on a stone and shook himself and laughed that high, surprised laugh. His mother head-butted him so hard he fell into the grass and then licked his face until he lay limp with humiliation and bliss. Tavin stood still, head up, ears to the north where the storm had written an ending, and then down to the south where the river wrote everything else. He came to Mara where she knelt with her hands quiet in her lap because there was nothing left to do. He looked at her hands for a long few breaths. He took one in his own paw quietly and turned it, seeing the blisters burst and the blood mingled with grit. "Did your kind always do this?" he said softly. "Step between the cut and the blade for people not of your blood." "Not always," she said, "but the best of us always hoped to." He tilted his head. "Then why do the old stories say your people burned worlds?" "Because some did." She met his eyes. "And when we were broken after the last war, we learned our hands could make something else." He considered that, then did something she had never seen an alpha do. He pressed his forehead to her shoulder where the pain lived, and he held it there. The pressure was light enough to be kindness. It was not ritual. It was invention. The very watching took the shape into themselves and made a memory out of it, one that would be a rule someday when the cubs watching were old. The rule would have no words at first. It would just be a way of standing close to a wound without making it worse. They climbed to the shelf with the last light, which had been scraped thin by the rain. They watched the valley glint and then go black, and the river shine like a slice of mirror no one had felt good enough to look into yet. The pack settled in a long, low line. The very old slept with their mouths open because they could not believe breath still came. The very young snored like birds. Mara stood near the edge. She wanted to see the water's skin catch the first look of stars as if nothing had happened down below. She thought of the stones and the numbers. She thought of a hand extended to an animal leap that was not her species and had nothing to recommend it except need. She thought of orbit and radio and the way the human world spun so far away now that time had little to do with it anymore. Tavin came to stand with her. He said, still soft because the night had entered all their mouths, "There will be those who tell it wrong." "They always do," she said, "but telling it right still has a taste." He leaned so their shoulders touched once. It was an accident, it was not. They moved on when the season allowed them, and in the lower meadows they rebuilt the shelters that had been taken apart. Mara walked with them for weeks, then months. And then she realized she was measuring time by how many knots a cub learned to make, and how many poles a pack could carry in their teeth before they complained. She built small bridges with willow and cord, and taught Vuri that you did not fight the river. You bargained with it using friction and patience, and the art of arriving at an angle. She taught them to weave lines the way her grandmother had taught her to braid hair. And the Vuri taught her how to read wind a half-day before it got unpleasant, and how to taste the air when it carried the spice of a snow that would be wet and mean. She made a tally in a notebook that was now a collection of patches stitched together with sinew. In it, she wrote numbers that matched the stones and drawings of the curtain that had held, and the mistakes where it had not. She wrote names of the Vuri who had been anchors, and the names of those who had been carried and had learned how to be carried without shame. She wrote one sentence alone, halfway down a page. "We are becoming something that uses the river without asking it to be less." Aru grew taller. He practiced not dying. He ran where he had fallen and rarely looked toward the place where the water had taken his breath. When he did, the look that crossed his face had a relation to grief that was not the relation Mara had learned on Earth. It was more like nodding to an old teacher, honoring but not an apology. He would look at Mara and his eyes would say something like, "I remember that our lives crossed there and that this crossing stayed." The season after, when the rains came early and the melt came late, Mara built the curtain again with the pack. This time it took half the time. This time the materials were ready. This time the adolescents argued about the best knots and insulted each other's work in a way that meant they cared. This time one of the elders took her own copper band off and braided it into the anchor and said, "Now this is the memory I want to wear." The flood came and the web held with fewer screams. After, Tavin stood and looked and said nothing because silence was the right tool. Mara sat with Aru and tied a knot with him that would be his someday when he had to choose. There were other dangers, fires that ran low and mean through the grasses, the thorn hawks that nested where none had the year before and considered Vuri eyes an invitation. There were quarrels among the pack and a scarcity of good words sometimes. There was an illness that rolled heavy through the old and took three, one of them a singer whose voice bent like light through rain. There was the day a human drone, years delayed by gravity's patience and the slowness of orbit, finally came down from the sky and blinked a hard green light at Mara's face and asked for status in an accent that sounded like home. She said busy and laughed alone for a while as the Vuri sneered at the buzzing insect nothing. By then the story had already begun its slow migration out of the valley. Hunters told it in brief phrases at night where the shelves turned cold. They said, a cub fell. They said, the river rose with teeth. They said, the human went first, before any alpha could tell her. They said, we bowed our heads because the world had made something right in front of us and you don't stand tall when that happens. The words were simple and so true that they became irresistible. They began to travel along trading paths, stitched to bundles of dried meat and to rolled cords ready for winter. They went from pack to pack, tribe to tribe. They crossed into the mouths of people who had never seen a human except at a distance, and into the den of those who had watched one die, and into the hut of one who had killed a human with his own hands and never slept clean since. Months later, a human salvage crew came down on a pillar of quiet fire to retrieve what they could from an old relay that had remembered where it lived. They carried guns because that is an old habit, and they carried an apology because not all habits are stubborn. They met the Vuri at the edge of a meadow cleanly. The Vuri brought mats and knotted lines and a willingness to stand near without knives. Tavan of the Gorge went, and Aru, and Mara, who had learned by then the new math of speaking between wolves and her own kind. The salvage captain was older, the kind of tired that has respect in it. She looked at Mara and at her shredded jacket and at the coils of rope that would not have been out of place on a boat on Earth 400 years ago. And she looked at the Vuri with their scars worn without apology and their copper bands. And then she looked at the river that made a line under the sky and seemed to her exactly like time. "What did you do?" the captain asked softly, eyes on the web still hung between stones in case, when it was worst. Mara said, "We made friction. And when you had less than you needed, we made new rules that were really old ones. Carry what you can carry. Tie yourself to someone worth tying to. You can come home," the captain said, and the word home felt to Mara like a fire under cold hands. It felt like a radio waking from sleep and clearing its throat into the night to speak to nobody who knows your name and somebody who remembers your voice. Mara stood. The Vuri watched. Aru's ears tilted the way his mother's had when something mattered, and he had not decided what his face should do about it. Tavan had no expression at all, which for him was the expression that said, "I know this matters more than any of us are ready for." Mara said, after the necessary breath, "I will. But not before the river slows, not before the new ropes are in every pack on the east side of the valley. Not before Aru can tie a line in his sleep and do it with his teeth if he must. Not before we move the old stones a handspan so the numbers line up again with what the valley is now." The captain nodded, the tired in her voice softening. "We can help," she said. "We can send materials. We can send engineers who remember how to work with hands." She looked at the Vuri and said carefully, "We can stand back when standing back is what you need." Tavan bowed his head. He knew a downturned muzzle meant many things. To him it meant yes without war. "You will tell your people," he said to the captain, "that the pack holds no grudge today for old stories you made true and then unmade. You will tell them we give you our attention. You will tell them the river and we have learned a way to discuss. This thing we do here is not victory. It is endurance. It is the kind that tastes like fat at the end of winter. There's no joy to it. There's only breath and enough to take another step." The captain said, with a strange sound in her throat, "We will tell them we met a nation of alphas, and they bowed their heads not because they were beaten but because something better had walked into the valley." That night, under the oldest old stars, they told the story again with different words to new ears. The salvage crew's historian wrote it down and did not embellish. She wrote iron where the valley wanted to put poetry. She sketched the web and the stones and the loops. She wrote, "When water rose, they did not ask it to be less water. They asked themselves to be more themselves." The Vuri singer who had survived the illness by sheer song spoke the story around the historian's words and made it a shape that a child could hold. Aru mimed the river taking him and everyone laughed and then grew very quiet because laughter after memory like that is an animal you don't want to startle. Weeks later, they moved downriver toward the sea. The valley widened. The river spread like a hand. Care's tilt pulled the weather down the way it always had. The sky built thunder again and then thought better of it. In the salt flats, the Vuri hunted fish that ran like burning wet silver in schools the color of knives. Mara waded up to her knees and threw a net with one hand, and it fell like a ragged halo and then rose heavy with thrashing. She grinned, and the Vuri marked another human shape to remember. At the estuary, the ruins of the old Numbers people stood on a shelf of basalt, squared off as if cut back to neatness after the long, wild whittling of time. The marks near the entrance matched Mara's notebook in 3 places and defied it in a 4th, and that was a good day. They walked inside and set lamps where old lamps had been. They felt the river's breath every 1,000 heartbeats when the tide breathed out and let the estuary be something else. They felt it again when the tide breathed in and made the river grateful and a little angry. Vuri and human voices mixed in a way that still surprised both. The salvage crew brought cargo, spools of polycord metal stakes, coils of chain, boxes of knives that folded politely, and left with boxes of maps and words, and some of the Vuri's braided hair ropes wrapped tight in cloth, which had more memory in them than they could carry. Someone put their head down on a stone for a moment and just listened to how it held cold inside itself like a seed. Mara showed a human engineer how to set a knot that would give before it killed a living thing it was tied to. The engineer showed a Vuri child how to make a lever with 2 rocks that would lift a boulder they had been circling for weeks like a stubborn mountain. An alpha showed a human medic how to sing at a wound so the pack quieted down and did not crowd the air over the hurt. The medic showed the alpha how to sew without pride or fear, and how to wear scars like a line you underline once so you can find it later without reading the whole page. One morning, when the mist clung low in the meadow and dew wrote tiny, clean lines along every grass blade, Aru came to Mara with a length of rope and put it in her hands. "Teach me the knot that is not a knot," he said, serious all through the mouth and foolish around the eyes. She smiled. "A slip?" she asked. "A bowline?" He shook his head. "The one you use in your voice when you say no to what feels easy and yes to what is hard." She nodded slowly. "Practice will do that to you," she said. She showed him the bowline anyway because that was how such teaching always began. The flood season ended. The river lowered, not to a size that was calm, but to a truth that was simply itself. The valley healed. The scars it wore felt like a catalog of nights lived through. The Vuri packs came and went with their stories and their moons and their rituals, some of which they altered because sometimes even the oldest habits are not old enough to be right. In time, the salvage crew lifted out in its pillar of light, promising a return that was more like a vow than a schedule. The drone overhead made its soft insect sound and then was gone. Somewhere in space, a relay woke fully and the human world turned its face, curious, toward a blue and yellow valley full of wolves that were not wolves and one woman who laughed quietly when she hurt. Mara continued. She stayed where the story had rooted. She wrote its changes across stone and rope and the web of a pack's new muscle memory. She slept by the river with a Vuri cub sometimes pressed lightly against her shin, as if night could pin her to the earth in case she ever forgot where the gravity came from. She woke to thin mornings and thought of Earth and did not break. She thought of a galaxy hung with old wars and didn't despair because despair was lazy and there was water to move. A decade later, which felt to her like 5 because time near the river behaved like that, a human diplomat came to sign a treaty with Vuri alphas in a ring where the curtain had once hung. He spoke too many words and then learned to step back. It was Tavin who put his head low and said the first part because the first part mattered. It was Aru, taller now, full of a young wolf's bright danger, who said the second with his voice low enough to be taken seriously. It was Mara who stood with her hands still and thought of the cub she had lifted from a killing current, and of the way a pack had lowered their heads and made silence into a tool. Later, when someone in a city whose engines had never smelled a clean river asked how the war had ended long enough for anything like this to begin, a historian said, "It didn't end. It ran into friction." And if that sounded like poetry where they were, out in the valley it felt like rope in the hand and the good burn of effort where breath meets bone. The galaxy, for all its hardness, likes a good story told true. It likes one told with details that can't be faked, like the way the air tastes when floodwater drains or the lesser sound a rope makes when it moves out of a cry into a hum. It likes the part where someone who could have left didn't. It likes the part where alphas lower their heads not to power but to the proof of courage. And the river kept its secrets and also gave some away to those who were quiet and those who were lucky and those who tied themselves to others when the crossing was not otherwise possible. The stones kept their numbers and also learned new ones. The pack kept their rules and made a few generous additions. On a late afternoon, when the sky was the color of bone and the grass made 1,000 whitish tongues in the wind, Mara and Aru stood on the old ledge above the ford at Hal Thrash. The ledge had new bite marks where ropes had worn it. The water moved as it always had, thick and sure. Aru's fur had gone shot through with gray along his shoulders. He stood like Tavan stood now, with a patience that had nothing to sell. He looked at the bend where he had been taken, then at the stone where he had coughed 10,000 days ago. "I remember," he said, simple. "So do I," Mara said. They went down together and stepped into the river where it was not too greedy and the water told their bones nothing the bones didn't already know. On the far bank, alphas lowered their heads, and not because anything ceremonial had been arranged, because it was the right way to stand in the face of endurance. Headphone, if you're enjoying this story, take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. In the seasons that followed, the curtain became tradition. Not a ritual, because rituals too easily become pictures of themselves, but a habit with muscle. Packs who had never seen the river's spine learned to weave mats with the summer's first grass, then rolled them and stored them high. Old cords, knotted with dead names, were brought down every spring and braided into the new rope so the past would have something to do but haunt. Children were led to the stones where Mara had traced numbers, and were told a story that began with a cub with a bright stripe on his nose and a human who moved before thought. The telling shifted in small ways depending on who told it. The ending stayed the same. The river has a tension, and sometimes it will pay it where you stand. With the salvage crew's cables and the Vuri's hands, trestles were anchored deeper. Posts of iron were set where stone did not hold, but never as the only anchors, always shared with living roots and the heavy memory of old basalt. Engineers from a dozen worlds came with instruments and humility. They learned to take their shoes off before stepping into sacred places, not because the Vuri demanded it, but because the river did not like sharp things stabbing its meat. On a dry year, when the flood did not come and the grass went yellow too early, the curtain was left slack. The pack still gathered there at the first storm and sang once, very softly, an old song learned from a human sea shanty, and a Vuri hunting call braided together until both lost their old edges and the new thing was smoother. Mara stood with Tavan and Hosey and their successors, and listened to a verse where the Vuri's word for water met the human word for stay and made a third word that fit exactly where it needed to. War did not end elsewhere. Somewhere far from Care, in a cold cube of vacuum, two ships found each other and did that old thing until they could not. Somewhere else, someone wrote a poem about peace, and it read like hunger masked. But the story of a river and a cub and a web and a moment when alphas lowered their heads went out like seeds in wind. Small, likely to be ignored, some falling on rock, some picked by birds, a few finding a crack with dirt in it and making a root. When people asked her, because by then they asked, where the human civilization would go now that the relay hummed and their politics could reach the wide maps again, Mara shrugged and said, downstream, upstream, sideways, wherever there is friction to make, we will help where the water presses against the wrong things. She had learned not to promise more. Promises had weight, and you could do only so many loaded carries in a day. She took off the jacket finally and folded it and put it in a box with a few small stones that had ridden in the fabric's corners since the first crossing. She wrote on the box with a very reed pen dipped in ash, "For the day you forget that you went first." A new human team came with blueprints for a permanent span. It would have cut the river cleanly, bolted plates, a truss, a road. It would have been strong and it would have been wrong. They showed the drawings to Tavan. He listened with his ears and his scars. He nodded when a detail was sharp. He put his head down politely at the end and said, "No, no." The engineer said, baffled because the math was right. "It is not that you measured incorrectly," Tavan said. "It is that you measured the wrong thing. The river is not only water and rocks. It is the pack's attention. You build us something that makes us lazy and we will die from it." They designed something else together, a boardwalk that could be lifted in sections when the flood came, quick with pins, child strong to learn. It could be carried upside down on furry backs, their tails balancing the weight. They learned the skill of making many small things instead of one big beautiful thing that would break under one big ugly force. Once, a trader from a far system, hard-eyed and unscarred by anything that could be sung, tried to invent a market out of this new routine. He tried to sell rope and kept back the best knots. He tried to build, then sell, the story to people who had no right to it except the small right of being alive. He was not cruel, only efficient. He did not know how to bow his head without counting what he might pick up from the ground later. The Vuri did not kill him. They walked him to the river's edge. Mara told him the story in full, without skipping the part where blood is always paid, and then she taught him a knot that would hold him to a person he loved in a crossing. She taught him how to release it if that person needed to go where he could not. He cried without shame because he had broken and had not known. He unrolled his cargo and gave it to the pack and also to his competitors and also to his enemies. He learned to lower his head in less time than most. When the flood came that year, it was middling. The curtain took it like a yawn. The alphas bowed their heads from old habit and also from new joy. A cub watched and asked his mother, "Why do you look at the ground when we win?" "So I can see if my paws are rooted," she said. That fall, the same fall, the human relay sent down a voice that said, "We are ready to send your story." The pack walked to the high hills where trees seated close together so the wind couldn't walk through the branches without asking. Mara went alone sometimes and stood at the place that had been the first anchor. She touched the rock. She closed her eyes. She felt for the vibration that a not alive thing carries if enough living hands have leaned on it with intent. She nodded then, not to anyone who could see, to herself, to the river's new idea of itself, to the future where people would say, "We keep the web tight in spring and we loosen it in winter so the ice won't pull it to pieces." They would say, "We pause to lower our heads not to force but to proof of shoulder and hand." They would say, "This is how we cross and cross again." In deep winter, when the river wore a rhyme and the moon was a thin thing slicing meat from things too fat with emotion, Mara lay in the shelter and listened to the pack breathe. She thought of the line near the beginning, "When someone says water is high, you do not pretend it is low. You measure, you not, you brace, you watch. You move when the moment is most itself. If you are the one with less to lose, you go first." That had been true 1,000 years and would be in another 1,000 if anyone cared enough to listen to old stones. Across time, the story touched others. A human on a mining rig off a different world saw a co-worker trapped under a shift and held the wait for a stranger as alarms clawed their ears. A Vuri scout on a snowfield tied himself to a human medic and walked into whiteout because there was someone crying 2 hills over, and the sound had the shape of his own cub's voice. A shuttle pilot threw her ship between debris and a hospital barge not because it was heroic, but because her grandmother had taught her a knot made of words. If you can carry, you do. When Mara finally left care for a while, it was not so much a departure as a long loop back to a place she already held in her bones. She left with a pack of rope coiled like sleeping snakes and a fist-sized stone with numbers on it that might have been older than the sea. The Vuri walked her to the valley's mouth, where the river finally lost its name and gave itself to the one that had been collecting it all along. Taven was very old. His fur had gone to silver. He still did not say goodbye because the Vuri do not. They say what is true and then trust. He stood with his head low and then up again and said, "We will be here. We will be braced. We will bow when we need to. We will not bow when we must not." Aru pressed his forehead to Mara's and said, "Next time I go first." His eyes sparkled and she saw the boy he had been in them still, not yet fully given away to the man. "Good," she said. "I am tired." "You hide it badly," he said, and then quickly, "Thank you." "For what?" "For the knot in your voice." She went up into the dark with a crew who had learned the taste of bowing where it mattered. She watched Care shrink, river no more than a thread of bright on a lump of blue and green. She felt briefly like she had betrayed something. Then she opened the box with her old jacket and put her hand on the fabric and the stones in the corner, and felt something like home reach up through material and touch her hand. It stayed there until the guilt decided to rest like old foam on a rock. At the relay station, she told the story to people who had never had mud under their nails, and they cried. She sent instructions for the curtain and the new knots, and for teaching no knot as a rule without its untying, because even the best binds need release when breath does not reach. She recorded a message to a school on a world her mother had only read about when she was a child. She said, "If you think being brave means not being afraid, you will wait too long to do anything useful. Being brave is cutting a cub's harness while your shoulder screams and the world tries to carry you away. It is knowing how to tie 2 people together and when to let the knot go." She went back. Of course she did. To the river that remembered and the pack that could not forget. She found Taven gone, his bands hung at the anchor stone. She found Aru older and careful in a way that meant he had given up none of his wildness, only domesticated it into something tools could use. She found the curtain rehung before she could say anything clever about it. She stood with her hand on the rope and felt it hum. She smiled where no one could see and then where many could. On a night split by quiet lightning, the alphas gathered in a loose ring and looked at her, and did nothing at all for a while. That was the best honor they knew how to give. The river ran under stars old enough to fetch whatever you asked of them if you knew how to tie a wish to a wake. The stones held numbers and the numbers held shapes, and the shapes held the exact way a human hand makes a loop and turns it through and ties it tight enough not to slip. The galaxy held this story as one holds a pebble, easily lost, easily cherished, heavy enough when you keep it in a pocket long enough to shape your walk. She stayed, she left, she returned. The river did not notice except when she stepped into it, and then it lifted against her shin and said, "You again? All right then, show me what you've brought." The answer was always the same: rope, numbers, a voice that could carry, a way of moving first before thought. In that galaxy that learned slowly and forgot fast, there are still moments that become laws. Some are written in blood and some in ink and some in water. This one was written in the lowering of heads and the cutting of a single strap. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.